How fiscally prudent is to get these tax cuts when the economy is booming and when the jobless rate is so low?
Well, first off, that's not the real number. That's a static-based number, and on a static-based number, when you throw in the gimmicks, you're probably closer to $2 trillion. But if you accept the fact that Secretary Mnuchin makes, or the argument he makes, which is the economic activity of a tax cut will generate revenue, then it'll be something less than that, probably more in the $1 trillion range. And that's on a $50 trillion spending period over 10 years, the federal government. It, as a percentage of the federal deficit, is probably less than 10% over that period. The issue is whether the economic growth generated by a significant tax cut is worth the price of the deficits. My view is you should do tax reform in a revenue-neutral basis, the way that Reagan-Rostenkowski did it, the way Simpson-Bowles did it. But this Congress doesn't want to do that because it basically means cutting more deductions, eliminating more exemptions, and those are politically hard decisions.
And, Senator, as a practical matter, would those cuts and deductions and exemptions come out of corporations every bit as much as they would out of individuals?
Well, most of the issue is on the individual side. Basically, there are four major deductions on the individual side. The first is state and local, which is being impacted. The second is health care deductibility, which isn't being impacted. The third is real estate interest deductibility that's not being impacted. And the fourth is charitable, which is not being deducted. Now, if you're going to do effective tax reform, which means effective tax reform means you get the rates down in exchange for eliminating deductions and exemptions. You got to step on a lot of toes to do that and do it right. This Congress and this president isn't inclined to step on very many toes. That's pretty obvious in their failure to take on the real drivers of the deficit, which are Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security.
More items seem to be recategorized these days as investments. How accurately does the budget deficit, in fact, represent the fiscal situation here in the U.S.?
Well, the budget deficit is a serious problem, and it's going to get worse. We've passed the Rubicon where basically there's a generally accepted belief that it's very hard to pay back your debt. And that's when you get debt to GDP ratio of over 60%. We're in 72, 73% range. We're headed towards 90%. There's nothing on the horizon that looks good on the area of reducing the deficit because basically it's primarily and almost totally driven by the health care needs of the baby boom generation as it retires. And that generation, which I'm a member of, is just starting to draw down on the health care accounts. It hasn't even hit the long-term care accounts, which are even more expensive. So there's no good news on the horizon relative to deficit unless this Congress and this president want to step up and do something constructive, which they clearly aren't willing to do. The president took Medicare and Social Security off the table a long time ago, and this Congress doesn't have the courage to put it back on.
Well, and in fairness, Senator, neither candidate for president in this last election made an issue out of cutting entitlements. Neither one of them said we need to come up and deal with this. So it is a bipartisan problem. That is a bipartisan problem.
It is. You don't expect it from, quite honestly, my liberal colleagues across the aisle. They've never been concerned about the deficit. In fact, under the Obama administration, they more than doubled the deficit and took us up to $20 trillion in debt and pushed us up to 70% debt to GDP ratios. But there was once an attempt to do this in a bipartisan way recently, and that was the Simpson-Bowles bill, which had bipartisan support. It had liberal Democrats like Dick Durbin and Ken Conrad, not overly liberal, but he is a Democrat of liberal means, of liberal attitude generally, and conservative Republicans like Mike Crapo and Tom Coburn and myself. So you can reach an agreement if you have leadership on the issue. Right now, there's no leadership on the issue.
When it comes down to the numbers, though, disaster relief this year is straining the budget. We have seen now that the administration is asking another aid package, but now they want to offset that with cuts elsewhere. How fiscally necessary is this when you also risk delaying disaster relief efforts?
Well, disaster relief is one of the responsibilities of the federal government along with national defense. National defense is the #1 responsibility. But when a certain part of the nation goes into extreme distress, as occurred in Florida and with Irma and in Houston, it is the obligation and in Puerto Rico, it is the obligation of the government to step up And I don't happen to think those types of expenditures should be conditioned on offsetting. Other things should be conditioned on offsetting, but things like that shouldn't be.